And here's what you missed on Plant Mama.
DIY self-watering systems. Sticking it right in the hole. Ooh, ooh. Oh God. R.I.P.
There they are.
So I'm back in my apartment after being out of town for a little over 3 weeks, and it's really interesting what happened to the plants.
Can you let me do it? So I'm back in my apartment after being away for 23 days to be exact, and I'm going to show you the plants and what they look like now. Here we have the pothos plant. It looks okay. It actually got pretty long. Let me step down here. These vines weren't nearly as long as they were before. I think maybe they were to there. I'm not really sure. But let's take a look at this self-watering system. So this had a full bowl of water. It's actually completely empty and dry. It looks like it worked. The soil seems more moist than the other ones that I had. It still looks dry though. So I'm thinking that it probably dried up pretty quickly, and that's why we have these couple of really dry and dead leaves. There's probably one vine here that's completely dead, but I'm not too upset about it. Seems pretty okay. It seems like it's growing along, maybe not as full, but look at that. This self-watering top watering system did work. I used one string and one little yarn piece, and this is gone. So probably a mix of evaporation and it absorbing water. Overall, it survived. My spider plant has gotten so freaking big. And look here, this is the self-watering system that was set up. This was probably filled about here with water, and it has absorbed all of that with the string there, and the string is just barely touching the water. So the soil is actually still pretty moist. So I would say this worked really, really well. The pot already had that rope up the side, and it was able to absorb water, and it has grown a ton because of that. Similarly, my false Aurelia, which is usually my thirstiest and neediest plant that will droop the quickest, looks totally fine. The water has been reduced drastically here. The rope, just the tip of it is still in the bottom water there. And the soil looks relatively moist. This method worked really well, especially when the string is still in the nursery pot there or along the side of the pot. My bird of paradise, I mean, it looks fine. I think this is a new leaf here that actually looks pretty small, probably because it was coming out when it didn't have a lot of water. It is a little stunted, but it's actually really, really dry here, and I think this water bottle, it actually did not come out at all. It's actually completely full in how I left it. That did not work at all. But the plant, because it's so big, it retains a lot of water. You can see how dry it is here. These are my butternut squash plants that I had in 3 different buckets. And it's actually pretty interesting to see how they differ. This one here seems to have been survival of the fittest. There's a lot of dry, dead ones on this area here. And the milk carton completely drained out, unlike the bird of paradise. I see a bloom here, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if it's the beginning or the end. And there's another bloom there. So it seems like something was happening for this plant here, even though it's incredibly dry. But it looks like there's still some plant that's alive, so that's awesome. This one is one that I had just in a bucket of water, and the water is completely empty beneath. And this one was actually one that didn't look that great. They all looked pretty wilted when I left them, and it looks like some of them sprung back to life pretty well, so that's good. And then this one here is another one where the milk carton did empty of water, but it's not looking hot. It doesn't look like the other one does. More of it is dry and dead here, which is a little disappointing, but I'm hoping that with some water, something can recover, or we can get a little bit of growth out of this. It looks like there were some buds here that never got a chance to bloom. That is interesting how we had 3 different situations with the butternut squash. Interestingly enough, this one also didn't lose its water. It seems like it didn't stream out. even though the milk cartons did. Maybe they need more holes poked in these, but the olive oil and the water bottle did not drain their water. But it seemed like it's relatively moist. I know I really watered this a lot, and I kept it in kind of a bucket so it could still absorb the water that it was losing from the drainage holes. And it seems okay. This probably just didn't need nearly as much water as the butternut squash to survive, because there were only 2 plants in here and a ton in the butternut squash. So now is the time that I'm actually kind of the most excited for, because I'm super curious, is to open up the bags. Let's see how they fared. Honestly, some look better than others. Some look like they grew a bunch, while others, just from initially looking at them, look like they might have rotted and died in there. The first one we have is the Madagascar Periwinkle Vinca. It actually looks really big. There were no blooms because I kind of killed them all, and it had been pushing out a ton of blooms last time I was here, but it looks like there's a little damage on this piece. Maybe I can propagate that. I did notice that they do kind of look like they grow backwards, and there is maybe a little bit of rotting or something on the leaves, but it actually has grown a really good amount since the last time I was here. And the soil stayed moist, so it did create a humid environment for it. Rotting could be from maybe some flowers that bloomed and then died and started to rot there. The next bag is going to be the sweet potato, and that did not fare well, even the slightest. We had a lot of good growth there. It's completely rotten. Sweet potato did not like being in a bag at all. Not even a little bit. It smells really bad too. I think there might be some mold. Sweet potatoes don't like humidity. That was not the right plan for those plants. This here are the Pilea peperoides pups that I was propagating. Edward. And wow, I mean, they look pretty good. I think this is the kind of plant that likes a humid environment. There is a little bit of rotting on some of the leaves here.
Can't propagate that.
I can't propagate that, you're right. But I mean, it actually did grow a good amount. There are some dead leaves for sure. I have to clean up these dead leaves. It's still moist, maybe too moist. I'm thinking I overwatered a lot of these plants when I put them in the bag. The next bag we have is the jasmine plant. This was a growth that I already had. It does look like I have a new tiny little growth over here. This here is a little baby of the philodendron micans, the heartleaf philodendron that I put in here. It was actually one leaf with one growing when I put it in, and there is a little bit of algae, it seems, on the top of the soil, but it has a crazy amount of growth. Look at that. I mean, it was this leaf and I think maybe another one growing, but this seemed to have loved that humidity, and it's starting to become a tiny little plant. The Venus flytrap is here, and this one I kept in water and kept covered like this by the window, and it definitely kept it moist, maybe too moist. Looks like 3 new growths here maybe, with hopefully new little heads coming. So I think this one didn't do that terribly. Here we have another propagation that I just potted up before leaving, similar to the jasmine. This is the shell ginger. It kind of got big. I think the propagations did a lot better in this bag than maybe some other plants, because one, they're not as big so they don't get crushed. They have room to grow, and they also just love the humidity. I mean, look at this. There's a whole new growth there. It lost its variegation. I don't know if it's coming back. This leaf actually has variegation, so that's super cute. Look at that. My little propagation jars that I had covered in these takeout containers. So my Begonia Rex propagation didn't really do anything. The soil stayed moist, but there's no new growth here, and I doubt anything will come. And then here we have the Christmas cactus pieces, which look like they fully recovered. I don't know if you guys remember, they were completely red and pink before. Totally rotten and gross, and I didn't expect anything of them, and it looks like they really enjoyed having that time to dry out. And these are some other little pieces of succulents that I needed to reroot. It's actually better than I left it. The last little bag I have to open up, I saw some things in here that made me sad. But I also saw some things that are kind of exciting. This was a little piece of propagation where the roots weren't big enough to leave in a jar because they would have dried up so quickly. And so first we have this piece of a begonia rex, which I think actually put out 1, 2, 3 new leaves. These look new. They're green though, but they're really pretty. I have one leaf that's kind of dead, but that's definitely looking a lot better. The rest that's in here is kind of sad. I'm not loving what I'm seeing. So in here I had my Scindapsus, also known as silver pothos. I had 4 pieces that were rooted and were really nice, and maybe I should have left them in a jar because it seems like they rotted and did not enjoy it very much in here. Got a completely rotten brown leaf. But what is this? This looks like a new little piece that's starting to grow, which makes me happy. So there's one little thing here that I think the roots were that long. Hopefully that will continue to push out growth. And then here we have a tiny little bit of growth here, and I think the leaf had died on this one. But I'm glad that it has new leaves, which means I still have hope having a little bit of this plant. But these leaves are so cute. They're so little. Oh my god. I mean, this one looks like it might have a new leaf coming, and the roots are still alive, so I'm definitely gonna plant these. I'm not gonna throw them out. Edward, my cameraman cannot control himself. But these roots are alive. I mean, look at them. They look great, honestly. I don't know how they would have fared if I didn't do this. So that's how the bags turned out. Some successes, some failures, but overall, I'm interested and impressed with what I've seen. I feel like I've learned a lot. No self-watering system on the fern. It looks dry, but it looks moderately fine. There is some minor leaf wilting there and a little bit of browning. I actually think this browning was here before. But overwhelmingly, the majority of the plant looks as it did when I left. And this was in a pot without drainage, so that might have contributed to it having more water stored in there. This little propagation of the jade succulent dried out pretty badly here. I don't know if there's a recovery for this one. My Tradescantia actually looks awesome. It was in a pot here without drainage, so I think that helped retain a lot of water. It has new growth, and it didn't really have any damage from not being watered for 3 weeks. This again did not have a self-watering system. My Buddhist pine, but let's call it Buddhist fine, because it was super dry to the bone. I just watered it, but it looks totally great. Not any leaf damage that I'm noticing here. The orchid has 5 blooms that look totally amazing. It was pretty dry, but these can go a while without water anyway, and it looks like it did well. Take a look at the cactus, which I actually left outside. It looks like there was a good amount of water and rain out here, which maybe I shouldn't have left the cacti outside. Maybe I actually should have left the butternut squash outside so it could have at least gotten rain. These are mostly the plants I brought with me, which are more of my delicate, needy, thirsty plants, or the plants that I care about the most. So I did pick favorites, but I don't know how these would have fared without any water. Okay, so you saw how a lot of the plants fared in the different self-watering systems that I created for them. Some were hits, some were misses, but I'm just going to summarize my findings from my little experiments just so you can see what my biggest takeaways were. The first thing I want to call out is to beware of that upside down water trick. 2 of my 4 bottles didn't even release any of the water. That's 50-50 that it would work or not work, and that's not something that I would want to risk. The ones that worked were my milk cartons, which were larger bottles, which is good. I don't really know why that is. Maybe the tops on the milk cartons, because they're the ones that pop up, you know, and not twist. Maybe those weren't even as secure, so when you turn them upside down, a little bit of water leaked out as well. And I'm thinking that the tops that screwed on maybe were too secure. So for those, if you're gonna do that trick, I would either recommend puncturing bigger holes into the top of your bottles or multiple holes so you can really make sure that the water is going to come out, and maybe even test it too before you leave your plants and see if water is actually draining overnight. My second takeaway is that the plastic bag method can really work or can be a terrible disaster. The plastic bag method definitely keeps the plants moist, which was the intention of my self-watering systems. I would say that the plastic bag method is great for plants that really love to be kept moist and that really love that humidity. The plastic bag is not drying out. The water is staying within that bag for a long period of time. My recommendation if you're going to do this is to water your plant a normal amount before you put it in the bag. I kind of went ham and was watering like crazy, giving them really wet feet and just soaking them like crazy, not really letting them drain, and then putting them in the bag because I was so worried that they would be drying out. But because that water is not leaving the bag and it's not going to dry out at all, your plant is probably going to rot if you do this. And I did have some plants that were rotting, unfortunately. I'm not gonna beat myself up about it because it was an experiment and I was willing to experiment with the plants that I put there. I did notice that I had a lot of leaves that were wet, maybe forming a little bit of fungus on that leaf from staying too wet, maybe having some root rot symptoms because they were not drying out even the slightest. And I definitely had plants that suffered because of that. I think this could be really great if you give it some water at a normal amount, just keep it moist, nothing crazy, and then close the bag. The plants that I saw that were the most successful were really my little propagations and the little plants that I have that love humidity. And I saw crazy amounts of growth on those plants that were in tiny little pots, and they were really flourishing within that bag because I think it created a really great environment for them. The propagations I put in there that weren't in soil but were in paper towels really didn't like it either because I think it was just so soaking wet, whereas the ones that I put in with soil and had freshly planted, they seemed to like that it kept them constantly moist, especially transitioning from water to soil. My third takeaway is that the string method is probably the most reliable. I recommend setting up your string within the pot. I found that those were the most successful, and for small plants they were easiest to pop right on top of a mason jar or a cup and have a reservoir of water right below it. For bigger plants, and if you're going to be away for a long time, I would recommend setting up multiple reservoirs of water with multiple strings leading to those reservoirs because a bigger plant is going to need more water and it sucks it up really fast. The string method definitely worked. The plants that I had with the string looked either the best, like I hadn't even left them, or suffered very minimal damage. But I know that those plants would have dried out way more if I didn't have that reservoir, so I'm confident that it worked. I just think I needed to set up more pools of water for the plants to pull from. My next takeaway is that bucket of water that you can set your plants in also works, but it does dry up pretty quickly. Those plants are going to absorb it quickly, it's going to evaporate. Unless you have a smaller plant, for example, my Venus flytrap, I just set in that pool of water and it didn't soak it up very much. I also covered it so there was not much evaporating. But again, I wouldn't recommend doing this with a plant that doesn't like to be kept moist or have wet roots all the time because it's going to start to rot. So it really worked for the Venus flytrap, which tends to like a constantly wet environment. I wouldn't recommend that for a succulent or a plant that isn't going to love absorbing all that water and never being able to dry out. It will just rot, and you would be better off not watering it in that whole time because underwatering is definitely better than overwatering for a lot of your plants. That being said, any of these self-watering methods will probably be better for your plants than just leaving them for a long period of time without water, especially in the summer and in the growing season where they need so much of it. Unless it's a plant that's pretty resilient, for example, succulents, I didn't set up watering systems for them and they all looked totally fine, like nothing happened. Or if it's a plant that you water pretty infrequently, my roommate's philodendron micans, I didn't set up a self-watering system because she actually waters it about every 3 weeks or once a month as it is because it's a hanging plant. It's just kind of hard to get to, and it really looked fine, maybe a couple of dry leaves here and there, but it didn't seem like it was affected too much by the lack of water because it was already used to an infrequent watering schedule. Don't be too worried if you come back after trying your self-watering systems and some of your plants look really dry, like they didn't work, or you didn't set up any system and they just look dry. Plants can do a pretty good job of springing back to life. I'm still watering everything and monitoring it and trying to make sure that they recover, but plants are resilient. They will be okay. They still have those roots, so I am pretty confident for most of the plants that they will be fine once they have several good waterings under them. And the takeaway I got from some of the, I guess you would call it produce that I was trying to grow in my little container gardens, I brought them inside because I was worried that it wouldn't be raining a lot and it would be so hot that they would dry out so quickly, but it seems to have been the opposite. I left the cacti I had outside and they were pretty wet, like it had been raining a lot and maybe even every single day, especially here on the East Coast. It does rain a lot in in the summer. I should have thought about that. So I think it would have been better for me to leave my sweet potatoes and my butternut squash outside, let them get the rain, because they were really drying out very quickly. They need a lot of water that some self-watering system just isn't gonna maintain. And the sweet potatoes did not like the bag at all. They rotted like crazy. It was honestly, opening it was like a bag of farts. Do not recommend that for those kind of plants at all. But I wasn't too worried about those plants dying because I can always plant more sweet potato or more butternut squash seeds, even though I was really proud of the growth I had. The butternut squash did have some good growth in it. It was a lot of it that died, but it seemed like survival of the fittest. Some were surviving really well. But I would say definitely leave your hardy plants that aren't going to suffer from maybe wind or falling over or a lot of water or just kind of the elements. Plants that are already outside perhaps, or plants that do well given the weather that you have, I would say just leave them outside. They're probably going to get more water and rainfall than they will inside of your place. And I do want to say, I know drainage holes are a must for plants, but I do have some plants that don't have drainage holes, and I found that those plants kind of didn't suffer that much. I didn't set up self-watering systems for them. I just soaked them through, and because they didn't have any drainage holes, they totally were able to absorb all of that water that was in the pot, and that kind of sustained them for a long period of time. So that's a perk for no drainage holes. The number one and most important takeaway I got from all of my DIY self-watering systems is to experiment with your plants before you leave them for a long period of time. Set up those systems where you still have time to observe what is happening with your plants and what is happening with those systems. Is water actually coming out of those bottles? Does the string feel wet? Is it absorbing that water? Does it seem to be doing okay in the bag? I was lucky enough where on my first trip I was able to take about 10 of my really needy plants that were really valuable and important to me that I just didn't want to risk leaving behind without water. And I even took 2 plants that I put in bags, my arrowhead and my polka dot plant, and I kept them in the bag while I was away, and I observed what was happening with them, and I noticed that they didn't really seem to like it too much. The polka dot plant was totally doing fine. It loved the humidity, but my arrowhead plant was slowly, I started noticing that the leaves were rotting a little bit, so I immediately took them out of the bag. I was like, I'm not gonna keep them in there if they don't like it. So now I know that, and if I had left them behind, who knows what would have happened to those plants. If you know you're going to be leaving, set up these systems a week beforehand, put the plants in the bag if that's what you're going to do, watch them for a couple days, and then you'll be able to correct or fix what's going wrong and see if, maybe that's not a good idea for that plant, or wow, that did work and let me reset it before I leave. That way you can see how the plant is responding to the different systems, even experiment with several different systems on the same plant, and you have a chance to fix it before things go way south, especially if that plant is important to you. I wouldn't recommend using a DIY self-watering system that you haven't tried before on a plant that's super important to you, because it can be risky. Just saying, it can be really risky and you may have a fatality on your hands, which is really depressing. Walking away from this though, I would say give all of these a try for different plants. They all seem to be better suited for different types of plants and the different environments that they like. But really, if you're just about to leave and you don't know what to do, I would say the string method is going to be the safest bet. The other ones can be pretty risky if they don't work, particularly the bag method. And the upside down bottle trick, if it doesn't work, is just like leaving your plant behind without any water. I mean, if the string method doesn't work, it's the same thing, but if you set it up correctly, it definitely works. It totally works. There's science behind it. It's really cool. So when I mean the string in the pot, I mean the ones that are coming out of the bottom here, as opposed to threading it through the top. They both seem to work, but this one you can really just submerge in a bucket of water super easily, and it will water the plant, especially a small one like this, totally fine. And there was a little bit of water left, but it was draining quickly. So the bigger the reservoir, the better off you are.